The grand hall of Wexford House had been hung with 300 candles for the betrothal ball, and every one of them seemed to turn its light toward Cordelia Marsh and away from her sister. Eleanor stood at the edge of the dancing, in the gray muslin she had let out twice and trimmed once too often, and watched the Prince of Halverstead bow over her sister's gloved hand, as though Cordelia were the only woman the room had ever contained. The crowd agreed. A duchess near the orchestra murmured to her companion, loud enough to carry, that the elder Marsh girl had a sensible face, and the younger had a face that would make a prince forget his own name. Eleanor heard it the way one hears rain begin, a small, cold fact arriving from above. And she kept her chin level and her hands folded, and did not let the words touch anything that showed. She was 24 years old, and she had spent 6 of those years learning to stand where the light did not fall. When their father died and left the two of them under the guardianship of their uncle, it had been understood, the way certain things are understood without being spoken, that Cordelia was the family's fortune and Eleanor was the family's expense. Cordelia was 19, golden, quick to laugh, easy to love. Eleanor was the one who kept the household accounts in a hand, so neat the steward had once mistaken it for engraving, who read to the village school children on Thursdays, who had taught herself enough Italian to translate the letters her late mother had never finished answering. None of these were the kind of thing a ballroom counted. The room had decided, long before tonight, that she was the plain sister, the practical one, the one who would keep house for whichever man married the beautiful one. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room that has already decided who you are, you may want to stay until the end of this one. Eleanor did not yet know that the man at the center of the floor had stopped watching her sister 3 full minutes ago. He was a tall man with a soldier's stillness, the kind that comes from holding very straight while something inside holds straighter. The Prince of Halverstead, Adrian by the name his late mother had given him and almost no one used, had come to England to choose a bride from among the daughters of its great houses, and the choosing had gone exactly as such things go. The beautiful ones had been presented. The advantageous ones had been arranged, and he had danced and bowed and said the level correct things and felt nothing move in him at all, until a moment ago, when he had turned his head at the wrong instant and seen a woman in gray muslin pick up a child's dropped glove from the floor near the supper room and tuck it into the small hand of a footman's son who had wandered where he should not, by DB, and send the boy off with 2 fingers pressed once to his shoulder, a touch so practiced and so kind that Adrian had lost the thread of whatever Cordelia was saying entirely. He did not know her name. He filed the moment away the way he filed everything, in a place he did not examine, and returned his attention to the floor. Still his eyes went back. Once, and then again, and a third time, to the gray muslin at the edge of the light. Eleanor felt none of it. She was occupied with the arithmetic of the evening, which was the only arithmetic she trusted. Cordelia must dance with the prince twice, but not 3 times. Their uncle must be kept from the card-room, where he lost what they did not have. The hem of Cordelia's gown, which had caught on a chair leg during the second set, must be mended before anyone of consequence noticed. Eleanor moved through these small necessities the way she moved through every evening, invisibly and well, and if some part of her ached at the way her sister's laughter rose and fell under the chandeliers like something effortless, she did not give that part a name. Names were dangerous. She had learned that too. Their uncle, Mr. Hargrove, found her near the windows during the third set. He was a florid man who wore his debts like a second waistcoat, tight and uncomfortable and impossible to remove. And he had a habit of speaking to Eleanor as though she were a sum that had come out wrong. "You will see that your sister sits beside His Highness at supper," he said, not looking at her. "And you will keep yourself out of the way. A prince does not wish to be reminded that beauty runs thin in a family." He said it without heat, which was worse than heat. He said it the way one reads a list. Eleanor inclined her head and said that she would see to it, and the small, cold rain went on falling, and she went to find the seating cards. What she did not yet know, what the room did not know, was that her uncle had already promised her elsewhere. There was a man named Mr. Pelham, a creditor of Hargrove's, broad and patient, and 48, who had agreed to forgive a sum of £3,000 in exchange for the elder Marsh girl, the sensible one, the one no one would miss from the marriage market. The papers were not signed, yet the understanding existed, the way understandings do in the space between two men who have shaken hands. Eleanor was to be the price of her uncle's solvency, and her sister was to be the family's glory. Both of these things had been arranged above her head while she mended hems and counted candles and kept herself, as instructed, out of the way. The supper room at Wexford House was long and gold and very warm, and the seating had been arranged with the cruel precision of people who believe arrangement is a form of fate. Cordelia sat near the head of the table, radiant, the prince 3 seats away across the white expanse of linen and silver. Eleanor sat far down, between a deaf colonel and an empty chair, where she could see her sister, but not be seen near her. It was, she thought, exactly where she belonged, and she had nearly convinced herself this was a comfort when she became aware that the conversation at the head of the table had turned, as such conversations do, toward her. It was Lady Bessborough who began it, a thin, elegant woman with a fan. She held a half-inch too high, the dowager who had taken it upon herself to manage the prince's English visit, as though he were a horse she meant to win a race upon. She had a candidate of her own, her great-niece, Miss Augusta Vane, a diamond of the season in ice-blue silk, and she did not love the way the prince's eyes had been wandering toward the foot of the table. "The Marsh girls," she said, to the table at large, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Such an interesting study in contrast. One can hardly believe they share a mother." She smiled toward Eleanor, with great warmth and no kindness. "The younger has all the bloom. The elder, I am told, is wonderfully useful. A treasure in a still room, I have no doubt." The table laughed lightly, the way a table laughs when it has been given permission. Eleanor's face did not change. Under the table, though, her hand closed slowly around a fold of gray muslin, and her heartbeat moved up into her throat where she could feel it, and across the long, shining length of the table, the Prince of Halverstead set down his glass and looked at her, directly, for the first time, with an expression no one in the room could read, and everyone in the room noticed. He did not look away. That was the thing. Men looked at Eleanor all the time, briefly, the way one looks at furniture to be sure of not walking into it, and then they looked at something worth looking at. The prince looked at her the way a man reads a sentence he intends to remember. And then he turned to Lady Bessborough and said in a voice that was perfectly level and carried the whole length of the table that he had always found usefulness a great deal rarer than bloom, and considerably harder to counterfeit. The table did not laugh at that. Lady Bessborough's fan came down a half-inch. And Eleanor, who had been called useful as an insult more times than she could count, felt something turn over in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not want. The evening ought to have ended there with the small balance restored, the way evenings in stories restore themselves. This, however, is not that kind of story, and the machinery that had been arranged above Eleanor's head did not pause for one level sentence from a foreign prince. The next morning, Mr. Hargrove informed his elder niece over a breakfast she had prepared and he had not thanked her for, that her situation was settled. Mr. Pelham would call on Thursday. The matter of the £3,000 would be resolved in the only way left to a family with a beauty to launch, and no money to launch her. Eleanor was to make herself agreeable. She was to understand that this was a kindness, that Pelham was a steady man, that a plain woman of 24 could not expect better and ought to be grateful. He spread marmalade on his bread as he said it. Eleanor sat very still and watched the knife move and understood, with a clarity that did not feel like grief because it had moved past grief into something colder and more useful, that the world had finished deciding what she was. She did not weep. She went instead to the place she always went, which was the small, cold room at the top of the house where her father's things had been stored, and she took out the one object she had saved from the sale of his effects, a worn miniature in a brass case no larger than a walnut, the portrait of her mother, painted the year she was married. The paint had cracked across the sky behind the figure. Her mother's face was small and serious and very like Eleanor's own. The same level brows, the same mouth that did not smile easily. The same eyes that the season would have called sensible, and the painter had clearly called something else. Eleanor held it in her palm and did not cry, and made herself a promise she did not yet know how she would keep, which was that she would not be sold while there was breath in her to refuse. 3 days later, the Prince of Halverstead came to call. Not at Wexford House, where the season's business was conducted, but at the narrow rented house in town where the Marsh family stayed. A house too small for the figure he made when he stepped down from the carriage. He had come, he told Mr. Brant Hargrove, with perfect courtesy, to inquire after both Miss Marsh and her sister, and Mr. Bray. Hargrove, scenting a prince's interest in his beautiful niece, fell over himself to send for Cordelia and to seat his highness in the good chair by the cold grate. Eleanor was sent for tea. It was the natural place to send her. She came in with a tray, and kept her eyes down, and set out the cups, and as she leaned to pour, the prince spoke to her quietly, under the noise of her uncle's flattery, in a voice meant for no one else. "You did not eat at supper," he said. "I watched. You served everyone at your end of the table, and you ate nothing yourself." Eleanor's hand did not shake, because she had trained it for years not to shake. But the tea trembled in the pot. "Your Highness is mistaken," she said. "I am rarely mistaken about what I have watched," he said. "Sit down. Eat something." It was a command. It had the shape of a command and the weight of one, and her uncle, hearing only the form of it, beamed at this princely attention to the proprieties. Eleanor, though, heard the thing underneath, the thing she did not want to hear, which was that somewhere in the golden noise of that supper room, a man had been watching to see whether she fed herself, and had noticed that she had not. She did not sit. For one moment, though, she looked up and met his eyes, gray and steady and giving nothing away, and her whole body became aware of exactly where in the small room he was. The way one becomes aware of a fire without looking at it, and she had to set down the pot before her hand could betray her. Cordelia arrived then, breathless and lovely, and the moment closed. It had happened all the same. And the audience, if there had been an audience, would have seen what Eleanor could not, which was that the Prince of Halverstead watched the elder sister cross the room to take the lesser chair, and watched the way she arranged her sister's shawl before she saw to her own comfort, and that something in his still soldier's face had begun, very slightly, to give. Over the next fortnight he found reasons. A prince does not lack for reasons. He invited the family to the theater, and the box he secured was the best in the house, and when the party arrived, Eleanor found that the chairs had been arranged by some invisible hand so that she sat at the front rail with a clear view of the stage, and not, as was her custom, against the curtain at the back, where the family stowed her with the cloaks. She noticed it. She always noticed such things. She told herself it was an oversight of the theater's people, and not a kindness arranged on her behalf, because the alternative was a thought she had no safe place to keep. Through the whole first act, she was aware of the prince seated one chair removed, his profile a still dark shape against the gaslight from the stage, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands in her lap, and felt his nearness. The way one feels the heat of a banked fire across a room, without looking, all along the side of her body that faced him. At the interval, Cordelia and Mr. Hargrove went out to be seen in the corridor, and Augusta Vane, who had joined the party at Lady Bessborough's contriving, went with them on her great-aunt's arm. For a moment, Eleanor was alone in the box, with the prince, the curtain stirring, the orchestra tuning below. He did not fill the silence with the small talk other men used. He asked her, instead, what she had thought of the second scene, where the wronged daughter had refused to defend herself before her father, and Eleanor, surprised into honesty, said that she had thought the girl a fool, that a person who would not speak in her own defense had already half agreed with her accusers. The prince was quiet for a moment. But then he said, his voice low, that he had thought the same once, and had since come to believe that some people stay silent, not because they agree, but because they have learned that speaking changes nothing and costs a great deal. He did not look at her as he said it. He looked at the empty stage, and Eleanor understood that he had answered her about herself, and she had no reply that would not give too much away, so she gave none. He sent, a few days after a translation he claimed to need, a packet of Italian letters of no importance, and let it be known that he had heard the elder Miss Marsh had some facility with the language, and would be obliged. The letters were nonsense. Old shipping accounts, columns of figures, and the names of ports. Nothing a prince could possibly require. Eleanor knew it for the contrivance it was within the first page. She translated them anyway, every one, in her neat engraving hand. The work taking her 3 evenings by candle after the household had gone to bed, because the work was honest even if the need for it was not, and because for those 3 evenings she had something that was hers. A task no one had assigned her as a punishment, and no one had thanked her for as a duty. She returned the packet by a footman. The next morning, a single folded note came back in the prince's own writing that her translation was exact and her penmanship finer than his secretary's, and beneath that one further line, that he hoped the labor had not cost her sleep she could ill afford to lose. She read those 2 lines more times than she would ever admit to any living soul. Then she carried the note to the grate in the cold room at the top of the house, and held it to the coals, and watched it curl and blacken, because hope was a thing she could not afford to keep where it might be found, and because a woman promised to Mr. Froston. Pelham had no business keeping a prince's handwriting in her gown. It was at Lady Bessborough's musical evening that he watched her do the thing that decided him, though Eleanor never knew he saw it. Augusta Vane had been seated at the pianoforte, and had begun a piece beyond her, and had faltered badly in the second movement, her hands tangling, the room going quietly cruel around her in the way drawing-rooms do. Lady Bessborough's face had frozen, and Eleanor, who had no reason to help the girl whose great-aunt had called her a treasure for the still room, who had every reason to let the diamond of the season fail in public, had risen from her seat at the edge of the room, and gone to stand at Augusta's shoulder and turned the page that was not the trouble, and murmured, too low for the room, the count of the passage that was, and stayed there, turning pages until the girl found her feet again, and finished to warm applause she would otherwise never have earned. Then Eleanor returned to the edge of the room and folded her hands and became invisible again. She did it because the girl was drowning, and she knew how to swim. She did not do it to be seen. The Prince of Halverstead had seen it regardless, from the doorway where he stood unannounced, and the last thing in him that had been holding straight let go. What Eleanor did not know, what no one in those gilded rooms knew, was why a prince of 39 had come to England, cold as winter glass and slow to choose. He told her himself, finally on the terrace at Wexford House during the second great ball of the season, in the only conversation of his life he had not rehearsed. She had gone out to the terrace to breathe, because the ballroom had grown too warm, and her uncle had been watching her too closely, and she had thought herself alone in the dark, until she found him already there, standing at the stone balustrade with his back to the light, a tall still shape against the night gardens. She had made to withdraw. He had asked her without turning, to stay. And then, in the cold air, with the music thin behind the closed doors, he had begun to speak in a way she had not heard him speak before, the level voice gone quieter, the words coming slowly, as though each one were being lifted from somewhere it had lain a long time. There had been a wife. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. There had been a wife, married for the alliance her country offered, a gentle girl he had never learned to love and had never tried to, and she had died bearing a child that did not live, alone in a cold palace while he was away making the very alliance her marriage had sealed. Unquote. He had not been cruel to her. He had simply not been there, in any way that mattered. And she had died believing herself unseen, and he had carried that since, like a stone sewn into the lining of his coat. He had been 3 days' ride away when the word reached him. He told Eleanor, and he had ridden through 2 nights to come back, and he had been too late by a full day. And the thing he could not forgive himself was, not the lateness, but the years before it, The long, courteous absence. The way he had looked at his own wife, the way the season looked at the plain marsh girl, as furniture to be sure of not walking into. "I told myself," he said, looking out at the dark gardens, and not at Eleanor, "that I would not marry again unless I could be certain I saw the woman in front of me. Truly, saw her. I had begun to think the certainty did not exist, that I had used it all up on a woman who never knew she had it." He turned then, and then I watched a woman in gray muslin feed everyone at her table and forget to feed herself. He drew something from his breast pocket as he spoke, his hand going to it the way Eleanor's hand went to the brass case in her own pocket, an old habit of grief, and she saw that it was a small folded portrait, worn soft at the creases, a young woman's face she would never meet. He did not show it to her. He simply held it for a moment, the way one holds a thing one is finally setting down, and then he put it away. Eleanor stood very still in the cold, and she did not reach for him because she did not know how, and she did not offer comfort in words because she knew how little words were worth against a stone like that. She did the only thing she had. She told him, quietly, that his wife had not died unseen, because he had ridden 2 nights to reach her, and a man does not ride 2 nights for furniture. It was not absolution. She had none to give. It was only the truth, offered plainly the way he had offered his. And she watched it land on him in the dark and saw his shoulders, which had been holding very straight, come down a fraction. The way a man's shoulders come down when a weight he has carried so long he has forgotten its name is, for one moment, shared. If this conversation has held you this long, you already know what the season was about to do to both of them. Because the machinery had not stopped, Mr. Pelham had grown impatient, Mr. Hargrove had grown desperate, and Lady Bessborough, who had watched the prince's attention drift like a tide, away from her great niece and toward the impossible direction of the elder Marsh girl, had decided that the situation required management of a more forceful kind. She arranged with her uncle's grateful collusion for the announcement of Eleanor's engagement to Mr. Apton. Pelham to be made publicly, at the largest gathering of the season, the masque at Wexford House, before the prince could be foolish enough to act on whatever sentiment a clever plain girl had stirred in him. Beauty would marry where beauty ought. Usefulness would marry its creditor. The order of things would be restored. In public, where the restoring would hold. Eleanor learned of it an hour before it was to happen, from her sister, who came to her white-faced in the small dressing room they shared at the great house, the masque already roaring below. Cordelia had overheard it in the card-room, 2 of Lady Bessborough's people speaking of it as a settled thing, laughing a little, calling it neat. Cordelia, who had been the family's fortune all her life, and had never once been asked to pay any part of its cost, stood with her beautiful face crumpling, and told Eleanor that their uncle meant to announce her to Pelham tonight, in front of everyone, before the dancing ended, and that the thing had been arranged so that no refusal could survive it. There was worse, she said, and could hardly say it. The prince had been told. Lady Bessborough herself had gone to him, with every appearance of regret, and informed him that the elder Miss Marsh had been promised to Mr. Pelham these 6 months, that the family had merely kept it quiet for the season's sake, and that Eleanor had been amusing herself with the prince's passing attention while her marriage was already settled. "He believes it," Cordelia whispered. "Eleanor, he believes you used him. He has not looked for you all evening. He stands by the windows, and he will not look at the stairs." And there it was. The dark moment did not come as a blow, but as a closing. A door swinging shut in a long corridor, very quiet, very final. Eleanor stood in the borrowed silk her uncle had purchased on credit for this exact purpose, the silk of her own selling, and understood that the things she had refused to hope for had been taken from her by people who had decided, as people always decided, what she was permitted to be. She thought of the burned note. She thought of the terrace and the stone the prince had carried, and how she had told him his wife had not died unseen, and how he must now believe that the one woman who had said such a thing to him had been lying with every word. That was the part that closed the door, not the marriage to Pelham, which was only a cage, but the thought of the prince by the windows, believing she had used his grief against him. She could feel the brass case in the hidden pocket she had sewn into every gown she owned. She closed her hand around it, and she did the only thing she had ever known how to do, which was to act from the one place inside her that no one had ever been able to arrange or sell. She told her sister the truth. "I will not marry Mr. Pelham," she said. Her voice was very quiet and entirely steady. "I have let them arrange everything else. I let them decide I was the plain one and the useful one and the one who would not be missed. I will not let them decide this." She took her mother's miniature from her pocket and held it in her open palm where Cordelia could see it. "Our mother married a man who chose her over a better match, and was called a fool for it her whole life. She was the happiest woman I ever knew. I would rather be a fool who was chosen than a treasure who was sold." Then she set the borrowed silk to rights, and she went down to the mask to refuse, in front of everyone, the marriage that had been arranged above her head, because if she was to be ruined, she would at least be ruined as herself. The great hall of Wexford House was a churning sea of silken feathers and candlelight, and Eleanor came down the staircase into it alone without a mask, which was itself a scandal, her face bare and level and white. Her uncle saw her, and moved toward her with Mr. Pelham at his side. Lady Bessborough saw her, and lifted her fan to the half-inch above her chin that meant a verdict was about to be delivered. And the room, sensing the way rooms do that, something was about to be made of someone, began to still and turn. Mr. Hargrove raised his voice to make his announcement, the words already in his mouth. The engagement of his elder niece to Mr. Parr. Pelham, a happy arrangement, long understood. Eleanor opened her mouth to refuse it in front of them all, to ruin herself cleanly, to be at last the author of her own undoing rather than its object. She did not have to, because the crowd between her and her uncle parted, not for him, and the Prince of Halverstead crossed the great hall in 3 long strides, and the whole roaring sea of the season went silent around him as though a hand had been laid upon it. He did not look at Lady Bessborough. He did not look at Mr. Hargrove or at the creditor beside him. He walked to where Eleanor stood barefaced at the foot of the stairs, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold borrowed silk. And he held out his hand, palm up, in front of 300 people who had spent a whole season deciding she did not exist. "Marry me," he said. "Not your sister, you." 5 words, and then a 6th and 7th, into a silence so complete that the candles seemed to hold still. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The line landed once into the held breath of the entire room, and it was specific, and it was irrevocable, and it could not be unsaid. Lady Bessborough's fan slipped from her fingers and struck the marble floor with a small, bright sound that everyone heard. Mr. Hargrove's prepared announcement died in his open mouth. Augusta Vane, the diamond of the season, in ice-blue silk at her great-aunt's side, was the first to understand, and the first to her credit, to look not at the prince, but at Eleanor, with an expression that on a colder face would have been envy, and on hers that night was something nearer to recognition. The crowd's faces turned one after another toward the woman in gray, the plain sister, the useful one, the treasure for the still room, and saw her for the first time as a prince had seen her all along. Eleanor stood with the brass case heavy in her hidden pocket, and the prince's open hand before her, and the whole season silent and waiting, and she did not faint, and she did not weep. She had been told who she was for 6 years. She knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with the room, who she was now. She put her hand in his, and the warmth of his fingers closing around hers was the first warm thing she had let herself feel in longer than she could measure, and her body knew before her mind permitted it that the long cold was over. It was Cordelia who broke the silence from the staircase by beginning to clap. Alone, her beautiful face wet and shining. And the sound of her 2 hands in that vast, still room was the bravest thing the younger Marsh sister had ever done. Then a second pair of hands, and a third. And the season, which had decided so confidently and so wrongly recognized its error in the only currency it possessed, and the applause rose like weather. Lady Bessborough did not applaud. She bent slowly, all the same, and retrieved her fallen fan. And when she straightened, her face had rearranged itself into the careful blankness of a woman whose script had worked everywhere except here. And she inclined her head a half-inch toward the prince and his choice, because even she could read the room, and the room had turned. The procedural matter of Mr. Stria. Pelham was settled within the week, and settled cleanly, because a prince's secretary is a more thorough man than a desperate uncle, and the £3,000 was paid in full from the prince's own purse on the single condition that Mr. Guindy Hargrove never again presumed to arrange the future of either Marsh sister. The secretary came to the narrow rented house himself, a spare, grey man with a leather folder, and he laid the matter out at the small table where Eleanor had poured tea a fortnight before, and he was scrupulous about it, naming the sum, naming the date, naming the condition, and requiring Mr. Hargrove to set his hand to a paper that bound him as firmly as he had meant to bind his niece. The creditor took his money and his disappointment and removed himself from the story. Mr. Creda, while Locksbrough, Hargrove, finding himself solvent and silenced in the same stroke, discovered a sudden and convenient enthusiasm for the match he had spent the whole season laboring to prevent, and spoke thereafter to anyone who would listen of how he had always known the elder girl would do well. No one corrected him. It was not worth the breath. And Cordelia, freed at last from the weight of being the only valuable thing her family possessed, laughed more easily that spring than she had laughed in years, and danced with a young curate of no fortune and excellent character, and was not arraigned toward anyone at all, and came to her sister one evening and said simply that she was sorry it had taken her so long to understand what the family had been doing to Eleanor, and that she meant to spend her freedom being the kind of sister Eleanor had always been to her. Eleanor told her there was nothing to be sorry for, which was not entirely true, and held her, which was. Lady Bessborough, for her part, did not apologize, because women of her station did not apologize to women of Eleanor's, but she did a thing that was, for her, very near to it. She called on the future princess formally, with cards left and a visit paid in daylight, where all the world could see, and she sat in the good chair and drank the tea. Eleanor poured, and said with her fan held at an ordinary height for once, that she had been wrong about the Marsh girls, that she had taken Bloom for Worth, because Bloom was easier to count, and that she hoped the prince knew his fortune. It was not warmth. It was something rarer in that world, which was a woman of rank, publicly correcting her own verdict, and Eleanor, who understood exactly what it had cost her to come, received it with a grace that gave the older woman back her dignity intact. Augusta Vane married well within the year, to a baron who adored her, and sent Eleanor, on the occasion, a single sheet of music, the very piece she had faltered over, copied out fair in her own hand, with no words upon it at all, because none were needed. Eleanor and the Prince of Halverstead were married quietly, in the small church at Halversted's English estate, in the last week of an English autumn, with the bare trees black against a sky the color of her mother's cracked miniature. She wore cream, not gray. She carried no flowers, but a single pressed bloom tucked into her glove, one her mother had pressed 40 years before in the pages of an unfinished letter. And when the vicar asked the prince whom he took, he said her name Eleanor, the given name he had not once used until that moment, and the saying of it was the most marked thing he had ever done in a church. The following winter snow came early to Halverstead, and it fell past the tall windows of a warm room where a fire had been built high against the cold. Eleanor sat near the hearth with her mother's miniature open on the small table beside her, the brass case catching the firelight, the cracked sky behind the painted figure no longer a wound, but only a thing that had survived. Her husband came in from the cold, with snow still on the shoulders of his dark coat, and did not speak. He crossed the room, and he stood behind her chair, and he set his 2 hands on her shoulders, facing the fire, with her the way she had once arranged her sister's shawl before her own, and they watched the snow come down over the gardens that were hers now, over the home that was hers now, in a silence that had nothing in it that needed saying. On the table, the small, serious painted face looked out at the warm room. Eleanor reached up and laid her hand over one of his, and he turned his palm to hold it, and the fire moved, and the snow went on falling, and the woman the world had decided not to see sat at last in a room built warm enough to hold her. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's story. If her quiet courage moved you, I would be glad to know which moment stayed with you. The fire is warm, and there is room by it. Yet.